Ladies and gentlemen, the time has come. I've got to talk about this new Drake album, honestly, Nevermind.
It's all so sudden, catching a flight.
I knew as soon as I heard this thing that I'd have to give a longer take on it because I like it, and I knew a lot of people weren't going to like it. I know it's been roundly clowned by both critics and fans alike, but yeah, for some reason this one really stuck out to me, in a good way. Very early on, I tweeted something along the lines of this being an album of the year contender, and the reality is that holds up for me, but I owe you guys an explanation as to why that is. In order for me to make this video and to tell this story, I have to start at the top. I have to tell you I'm kind of a Drake fan, or at least I was. But let's start at the beginning.
You know, a lot of girls be.
So back in the day, my introduction to Drake would have been some Young Money singles that came out, like Bedrock. You guys remember Bedrock?
Oh, that was your girl. I thought I recognized it.
It's a goofy song with a goofy Drake feature, but that's where this guy kind of began. It was that, and it was also Best I Ever Had, was another big Drake single back in the day. Not too long after those singles, I had an older cousin that was telling me, hey, you got to check out this new Drake song. He's got an album coming out. You're going to love it. And he showed me Find Your Love. This was before Thank Me Later came out. I really dug it, and I was excited. And that was maybe, as far as my life's concerned, one of the first albums that I was ever anticipating before it came out. And then it came out, and I loved that album. And that CD was actually one that I had in my car when I first got a car. So it was one that I drove around listening to all the time. And if you've got CDs like that in your car, you understand the significance that an album like that's going to hold in your life. Not too long after that one was Take Care, which many regard as one of his best, if not his best album. And then a couple years after that was Nothing Was the Same, which for me, this was like the height of Drake. I was enjoying all three of these albums. He was really establishing a signature sound, and each of the albums held personal significance where I listened to them in certain contexts, and I can always think back on those albums to remind me of those times and places where I heard them. It's a really cool experience that you can have with a lot of different music, and for me, yeah, it was Drake. It's important to understand at this time, when these albums were coming out, I wasn't really a hip-hop head. That didn't really happen until about 2013. So it would have been around the time or after Nothing Was the Same came out. But prior to Drake, I wasn't really listening to a whole lot of hip-hop. Anyway, those three albums were great for me, but then 2015 happened. This is where things might get a little controversial because he puts out a mixtape. If you're reading this, it's too late. I believe that was on Valentine's Day of 2015. And to this day, a lot of people say that is Drake's best album. I don't know what they're talking about. I think it's one of my least favorite. It's one of the least interesting Drake albums for me personally. I understand what he's doing, and of course there are a few hits on there, but the reality is that Drake kind of shed his signature style in order to sound like a lot of other rappers. You could plug a lot of different rappers into that album and it would still make sense, and that's part of the problem for me. It was an identity crisis for Drake. Not only that, but there are songs on the album that are back-to-back and sound almost identical. The two in question, which I encourage you to kind of play on top of each other, 10 Bands and Energy have almost an identical beat, and they're back-to-back on the album.
I got enemies, got a lot of enemies, got a lot of.
And that in itself felt like a betrayal, because I was like, what are we doing here? Why is this? How can you put this out? How can you give us this? You know, coming from a guy who had like pretty good rap hits and good pop hits, I was just very disappointed with that project. Yeah, it was Drake in all rap mode, but he wasn't really rapping at his highest level. And he didn't sound like himself, and that, to me, was frustrating. Also in 2015, he does a collaborative project with Future, What a Time to Be Alive. Again, not one that really connected with me. I still am not a huge fan of Future, but I can respect a few songs on there as well.
I did the digital dash.
To me, though, that project has the same problem that If You're Reading This, It's Too Late had, which was that it's Drake trying to fit into some other rapper's lane. In that one, we're able to point to Future and say he's trying to do the Future stuff. It's not like he's sounding like Future, but again, it's just not Drake's style.
Your lack of effort got me rapping different.
This is obviously the part of the video that I think a lot of people are going to disagree with. And I just have to point out here that I'm not a fan of the same Drake that a lot of people are a fan of. Because the world was on board with both of these projects, and a lot of people still regard them very highly, but it's just not the kind of Drake that I like. It's not the kind of Drake that I enjoy. I told you I like the first three albums, but if you want another picture of the Drake I enjoy, look at 2016. He releases Views. Views is one of the first albums, as far as I can remember, where he kind of received lukewarm reception from both critics and fans. This was also right around the time that the streaming era was starting, where people were moving away from physical purchases and everything was either Spotify or Apple Music. But in my opinion, Views elevated Drake once again to his own sort of sound or style. Now you may be thinking, is it really Drake's style because he's doing this strange patois and the Jamaican accent all over this album? And you are correct, and it doesn't sound entirely authentic. But I'm telling you, this project has some of the most balanced music we've heard from Drake. Some seriously good pop and dancey hits, and some genuinely pretty good rap songs.
Grips on your ways, front way, back way. You know that I don't.
I said this in my review of the album, that if you remove about 4 tracks from this, it becomes one of his best albums. I stand by that. I think I replay Views more than any other Drake album. Of course, I replay it minus the 4 songs. And I don't know if I want to get into and give you guys the sauce and tell you which 4. I can give you a hint. You're going to for sure cut out Hotline Bling because it's a bonus track that doesn't belong. The broader point here is that I loved Views, but the big problem I had with it was that it was too long. And it turns out that that problem would persist with Drake albums moving into the future. The next few big albums that we get from Drake, More Life, Scorpion, Certified Lover Boy, I don't even like saying that one. Those albums are all bloated. They're all too long. And not just in the sense of, oh, I don't want to listen to it for that long. No, none of those albums can fit on a CD because they exceed the maximum capacity for a CD, which is a little under 80 minutes. Guy, nobody needs an album that long. I could maybe see doing a huge album like that if you had a lot to say, but Drake does not have a whole lot to say. That's not how we listen to Drake. Drake might be the only rapper that we can rely on to talk about texting on every other song.
My side girl got a 5S with the screen cracked. Still hit me back right away. Soon as you see the text, reply me. All that gray in our conversation history, you. Text go green is a little different, don't it?
I truly do think that should be some kind of drinking game or something. As you listen to a new Drake album, anytime he mentions anything about texting or an iPhone, you got to take a shot. So he puts out all 3 of these Bloated albums, and in between there we have a couple other things like Care Package and Dark Lane demo tapes. Across all of these projects, there are flashes of brilliance. And I use the term brilliance a little loosely here, but there are flashes of really good music. During this era of the Bloated album from Drake, he's still making good music here and there. You know, he puts out these single packs every now and then. I feel like I always find at least one song that's really good, and that's where some of his best work as a rapper comes out. If you need some illustrations, go listen to Diplomatic Immunity or Omerta. Those songs are fantastic. That's the kind of rapping Drake that I would love to hear a full album from. Drake's become a very corny character. He's always been a bit of a meme with the Drake the Type of Guy jokes, but then he becomes an even bigger meme on TikTok about all the sort of cartoon character behaviors that he engages in, or that we like to think he does. Anytime we hear some cartoony beat, we think, oh, don't let Drake get a hold of this. He's just a goofy dude, and I don't want to get into too much of it, but whether it's texting Millie Bobby Brown or braiding the Nike symbol into his hair, he's just Drake. There's nobody quite like him, and he's a strange guy. He's a very dominant musician, and there's no denying the accolades that he's achieved, but
he's goofy like that.
Higher powers taking a hold on me.
He's goofy like that, and his music is kind of perpetually immature, which for the most part doesn't really matter because it's just fun to listen to. But I've reached a point in my life where I don't expect a whole lot from Drake. I would love for him to turn the rappability dial up to 10 and give us a full project like that, but we'll have to see if that ever shows up. So earlier this year, Drake reveals the album cover for his newest album, Honestly Nevermind. It's sort of this metal font washed out. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, are we finally going to get the rap album from Drake that I've been thinking about for years? I remember saying, based on this cover, I feel like it's either going to be this big rap album or he's going to lean fully into the dance hall stuff. So we end up getting the full dance record. It's not really dance hall styles. It's more of electronic house type music. It's very low key house music. It's more about setting a vibe than it is lighting up the club. Though there are a couple of tracks that I could see lighting up the club. So after, listening to this album the first time, second time, third time, I found myself liking pretty much every song. The one that I don't like, even to this day, is Currents, which features the squeaky bed spring sound, sort of an eater type of... Don't put that in, I don't want people sampling that. Listen, I understand it's a reference to some old Jersey beat or whatever, but that doesn't make it enjoyable for me. That doesn't mean it doesn't hurt my ears. I don't want to hear that as a song. The song other than that is decent, but yeah, that one is the closest there is to a skip on here for me. Falling Back is interesting because the beat is phenomenal. I love the way that beat comes in.
Hey.
But Drake just kind of sings very strange over that song for quite a long time. I don't know if he's aware that he's not quite hitting the notes. I hope he is. Maybe he's doing it as a bit. Like, look, I don't have to sing well and you'll still listen to it. I don't know. Maybe I don't have to listen to it. There's plenty of other songs on here that I enjoy more, though. One of my personal favorites is Massive. Now, Massive is, well, it is massive. It feels like the kind of song that would go off in the club.
I don't wanna.
It's still a bit low-key, which is cool, but yeah, it's a lot more energized than most of the album. Towards the end, second to last track, we get Liability, which sounds like the old Drake when he used to be emulating Houston styles. And then the album closes with a 21 Savage feature and Drake rapping, which is kind of cool to see, even though it breaks the mold from the rest of the album. It's not a bad way to close it out, in my opinion. So yeah, the reception to this was very mixed. A lot of people were hating it right off the bat. And there's a lot of, hilarious memes out there about this album. I don't think there's too many music critics, whether you're looking here on YouTube or anywhere, that are going to talk about this album as being something amazing. And look, is it the best dance record I've ever heard? Absolutely not. Is it even objectively good? I don't know. Who am I to say that? What I can tell you, though, is that this album accomplishes its goal for me, which is to kind of get me moving and to get me enjoying myself. Like, I like this. I like the mood that this album creates. I like that Drake decided to commit to a style, even if it's not a style that he executed perfectly. Even if it's not a style that a lot of his fans enjoy, I appreciate what it is, and I enjoy the style here. Drake, being somebody who for years has put out these very long, bloated albums, decides to give us something that is short and mostly consistent. The lyrics might not be much to write home about and kind of could be consistent with most of his output, but it just feels like a significant departure from what I'm used to from Drake. And that's what I've been kind of hoping for years at this point. Chances are, if you don't like this album, you either aren't interested in the dance style that he adopted here, or if you are interested in dance and house music, you just think this is a cheap imitation. I can't argue with that. And I've seen a lot of people levy this same complaint against an album like Yeezus from Kanye because they say this is just a cheap imitation of a group like Death Grips, which could also be true for you. Comparison can definitely kill an album if you're hearing it and it's just reminding you of a better artist. But this one doesn't do that for me, and I think it's because of the style that he has here, because he's not trying to be the most explosive dance record. To me, it doesn't feel quite as much of an imitation, at least for the dance artists that I enjoy. I'll be the first to admit I'm probably not aware of any artists who he may have ripped off here, or if you think he sounds exactly like somebody else, I'm probably just not aware of that. But I just appreciate the album for what it is. I think it's funny that I wound up talking about Yeezus here because some people wanted to call this album Drake's Yeezus. I am going to try my best to unpack that because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's terms that get thrown around with this album, and some of them I think are used incorrectly. The first is experimental. This is not an experimental album because Drake is exploring existing genres of music. It might be new to him, but it's certainly not new. I do think the album is a risk, though. While it's not experimental, it is a risk because it is Drake departing from styles that he knows well and that he knows will perform well for him. So it is a risk, but it's not experimental music. I don't think Drake's trying to redefine any genres of music with this one. If I were to compare this album to anything, I would call this Drake's Honestly Nevermind, because that's what it is, and that's a cheap shot from me. At the end of the day, I am the type of person that likes to see artists taking risks, especially when it's an artist as big as someone like Drake. A lot of artists reach a certain level of fame or accomplishment, and they can kind of coast, right? They can just let off the brakes and just kind of put out the same thing or some variation of the same thing over and over, and people are going to eat it up. We love that artist for who they are. People love consuming new Drake albums, even if they sound pretty much the same throughout and he doesn't have a whole lot of new stuff to offer us. I think communities of more critically minded listeners will tell you that albums like Scorpion or CLB are not very good, but the numbers suggest otherwise because the average listener just wants to hear Drake. They don't really care what he's singing about. I think the average listener probably enjoys 2C Slide. That average listener is not me. I do not like that song. I do not want to hear it ever again. But for an artist as big as Drake to decide to make something completely different and to try his hand at something completely different is very exciting to me. And maybe the title is kind of suggesting that. Maybe he was aware that this was a risk. I'm sure he was. Maybe he was aware that a lot of his fans weren't going to enjoy it. And the title suggests that it's kind of a throwaway, kind of a one-off. You know, honestly, never mind. You guys can just listen to this. If you don't like it, oh well. Like, there'll be another album coming from me that'll sound like everything else. But I think you should own it a little more. I don't think you should be embarrassed to this. I think there's a lot of critics and people that would disagree with me on that, but I like what he did here. I don't think I'm the only person to feel that way. Maybe I'm in the minority, that's fine. But like I said, I appreciate artists taking risks when they have that big of a platform, because Drake is somebody who, you know, like the Banks in '08 is just too big to fail. There's not much he could do that would hurt his career. Even an album like this, I mean, yeah, it might be a little speed bump. Maybe not a lot of people enjoy it, but I guarantee you the next album he puts out that sounds like CLB is going to perform just as well as CLB did. And it'll probably be just as boring for someone like me. There's another big artist out there who took a big risk this year making a dance album, and that artist's name is Beyonce. Beyonce's album was much better received than Drake's, probably because it's Beyonce, but also because she put a lot into that one. The level of energy on that is much higher than it is on Drake's. But man, I don't know, you ask me, I kind of prefer the chill vibe of Drake's album. I cannot say and will not say that it is better than Beyonce's, because that will probably get me murdered. But I can say that I personally enjoy it more, and I'm going to find myself returning to it more than I will Renaissance. The last thing I need right now is the Beehive stinging me, okay? Please have mercy. All right, so here we are. Final thoughts on this album. Like I said, for me, this is an album of the year contender. What does that mean? It doesn't mean it's number one. I've already told you what my number one is. It's Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers from Kendrick Lamar. However, album of the year contender for me means this is most likely going to make my top 10 by the end of the year. As it stands right now, I think it's probably in the top 5. I don't know exactly where. I'd have to sit down and figure that out, but it's up there, and I'm still enjoying it. And if you want to go out and give it another listen, maybe you didn't like it the first time around, just put it on while you're hanging out, maybe in a hot tub. I listened to this album in a hot tub. It was great. If you don't have a hot tub, maybe you draw a bath. Do people draw baths anymore? That's about all I have for today. But as always, thank you for listening. And whether it's 10 seconds or 10 minutes, I'll see you on the next video.
You say I changed, I say that I millions. I did. The toughest act that follows back.